All right. Hi, everyone. Brett and I are super excited to join you all from San Francisco, California. If you are a product-led company, you know one thing to be true. Having confidence that you're building products that are actually going to motivate behavior change in your users is probably pretty important to you. And so in this talk, we're going to walk you through this proprietary mixed method research framework that we helped create to help a lot of Silicon Valley's hottest startups leverage behavioral science in their user research so that they can ultimately build products that actually motivate behavior change. Now, before we dig into exactly how we do this, I want to take a moment to introduce everyone to behavioral science. So simply put, behavioral science is the study of how people really make decisions. And we like to emphasize that word really because there's also another field of study, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, called economics, that also studies how people make decisions. And while economics assumes that we're always rational and therefore decision optimizers, in contrast, research done by Nobel Prize winning behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler show that we don't always make rational decisions. In fact, our emotions and our environment being both a physical environment as well as a digital one, as well as social factors, heavily influence our decisions. And I'm pretty sure that if you've interacted with the human race for more than 2 minutes, this should come as no surprise to you that we're not always rational. That in fact, there's a gap between what we say we want to do, and what we actually end up doing. So as an example, we all know what it takes to be healthy. Largely speaking, eat your fruits and vegetables, get some sleep, and exercise daily. But how many of us hit that snooze button this morning and skipped our morning workout because we were binge watching Netflix last night? So what behavioral science is particularly good at is kind of closing this gap between knowledge and behavior. And I think that's a particularly important thing for product-led companies to really help figure out. And so I think the danger in not recognizing the role that people's emotions and their environment and social factors play in how they make decisions is that we ultimately start designing products based on this assumption that our user is more like Spock as opposed to Homer. So when you think that your users are more like Spock, you assume that they're always rational. And so you think that if I simply give them more information and more choices about our products and solutions so that they can be well informed and make the optimal decision, that's the way to go. And in contrast, when you actually recognize that your user is kind of a little bit more like Homer Simpson, sometimes can be irrational, has the best intentions, but is not perfect, you recognize that you actually want to limit the information. You want to systematically nudge your users towards that optimal path. So hopefully now that you have this very high-level understanding of how a behavioral scientist sees the world, we're going to have Brad, who's our chief behavioral scientist, walk you through how we apply behavioral science insights into our user research.
Everyone. So before we dive too deeply into how behavioral science can help us do research, I want to acknowledge that there are lots of different great methodologies for doing research out in the world. In dealing with many clients, we've come to realize that some people define research the way that you did in high school when you would Wikipedia some stuff and put in some Google citations, all the way up to very sophisticated journals and clinical research. And there's a big gap in the terminologies that we use here. So we're going to try to talk a little bit about how we can use behavioral science to improve our qualitative methodologies. So what I mean by that is shallow but broad, talking to folks in a very contextualized way, maybe using surveys or doing interviews to sort of shape some context, and how we can use behavioral science to improve our quantitative methodology. So a more narrow approach that has a measure that we want to optimize, that has a big sample size and a legitimate power and effect size. So in the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about how behavioral science can be used and insights from behavioral science can be used to de-bias our qualitative research. And then in the second part, Shirin's going to talk us through how we can use behavioral insights to run better quantitative experiments.
Awesome. And so, one of this research methodology that we're starting to talk about, we call it the science of design. And one of the challenges that we had at Next Step when figuring out how to do our research was how do we create a methodology that is both actionable and timely? Because we work with a lot of technology startups that really need their insights yesterday. And so we developed the science of design in a way that is both nimble. It allows us to actually create meaningful insights in a matter of weeks, not months. And it's also backed by quantitative research, which allows us to have confidence that the interventions that we're introducing lead to actual behavior change at scale. So now Brad's going to walk you through the different elements of the science of design, and incorporated in that are some tips for how you can think about leveraging behavioral science in your research process.
Yeah, so behavioral science is really grounded in the world of quantitative experimentation. And that's because it was originally started in laboratories at universities. And laboratories are excellent for controlling context. And that's what you need when you want to understand if one very specific intervention is going to change somebody's behavior. The real world, however, is a little bit messy. And so instead of trying to control all of the context, often it helps a lot to understand that context first and then start running experiments within the understanding that you have of this broader context. So you still want to run controls, but you want to understand the environment that people are making decisions in. And so our science of design methodology does a really nice job of trying to identify all the different opportunities where you might be able to take behavioral science and apply it with different parts of different types of research, as well as create insights and usable places for design, like Shirin was talking about earlier on. So as we go through this, when we want to identify where opportunities are, we're doing our behavioral audit, and that is a way of sort of doing a deep dive into people's kitchen and trying to understand what it is that their objectives are, as well as trying to consume the product in a way that isn't biased before we go in and talk to the C-suite. Taking those two things, the sort of outside the bubble approach and inside the bubble approach, and overlapping them often creates a lot of insights about where behavioral science opportunities can be deployed, and puts us in a place to really start to unpack that context. Then we want to move on to our next step, which is our qualitative user research. Those places where the overlap may be problematic. Sometimes you have great just do's that you can just sort of deploy because you've seen them work 100 times. But other times you need to understand that context more so you can keep digging into the research. And that's where we really find that there are powerful new ways to try to create new interventions. Once we have done that qualitative research by talking to people, we try to develop some hypotheses around what types of interventions will work best to optimize the behavior that you want to optimize. And it's important to think of these hypotheses as true hypotheses. That means that they're falsifiable and that they're coming from insights from the lab. So you want to take something like loss aversion or social proof and apply it to your intervention. And then you know that if it actually works, you have an insight that's sort of durable as opposed to version 1 versus version 2. Of course, once you have those hypotheses, you need to test how that intervention works using quantitative research. Often that's an A/B test where you take one of your hypotheses and you design an intervention that leverages them versus a control. And then once you have done that, if you've done it all properly and analyzed the data, you have a much better understanding of why people make decisions. If you just ran blue versus red or version 1 versus version 2, you very quickly run into the problem that you don't understand exactly why the person made that decision. Versus if you use loss aversion and that changed people's behavior, then you have a very portable way of taking that insight and putting it into the rest of your product, putting it in your marketing, putting in your sales process. And so we can take those insights and develop a playbook that makes them a lot more useful. So with that in mind, let's think a little bit about how we can apply behavioral science to improve one of those steps, which is qualitative research. With this, we can think about a lot of the different insights that come out of the realm of behavioral science and how we can use them to ask better questions in the qualitative research. So we're going to talk about 5 different places where when we start working with clients, we see a lot of behavioral biases in the way that they build the questions when they do qualitative research. And hopefully we can walk through this list, and then you can use these insights to ask better questions when you do your qualitative research. So the first thing that we want to avoid when we're doing qualitative research is priming, and making sure that we ask balanced questions. So priming is exposing people to one stimulus that then influences their response to a subsequent stimulus. So if you're asking people leading questions, or if you're asking them why you think your product is good, or to rate it on a scale of how easy it is, that's a prime for them to answer in the way that they think you want them to answer. And so you're going to be biasing the way that people respond if you're asking them questions that prime them to give you responses that are leading. The next thing that we want to avoid is confirmation bias, or you want to make sure that you're seeking counter evidence. Confirmation bias is a tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of your existing beliefs. And so lots of people go into qualitative research thinking, I need to confirm the thing that I think is correct. That's a very normal human way of approaching something. The way that is much more effective and makes your insights much more durable is to say, I want to shoot down this idea that I have, and if it lasts through all of my different ways that I can think of to tear it down, then I probably have a much more durable insight. So go in thinking, how can I pull down this argument? And then if it survives, it may be a real true insight. Then you want to make sure that you stick to the script, but leave it flexible. So this is thinking about what you know versus what you don't know that you don't know, and all the shades that go in between there. Often with qualitative research, the thing that is most valuable is the thing that's right in front of your nose that you didn't think to ask about. And so if you cram 20 questions into 20 minutes and don't leave any room for people to talk or ramble or answer questions in different ways than you had thought to think of, to ask them, you're only ever going to get answers to the things that you think that you know. And often, if you let people sort of go off script and build in that time, you tend to find more things that you don't know that you don't know. So let people ramble, build a little bit of time blocked into your interviews to let them talk. But ask your questions and make sure that you have something to compare. After that, we want to make sure that we break the questions and and concepts apart so that we avoid a lot of the things that we just covered. So if you are asking, why is my product great, and how do you use my product and why is it great? Those are concepts that are presupposing an answer from a previous part of that question. And so you're, again, doing a little bit of priming, a little bit of confirmation bias, and leading them to give you an answer, or not giving them the medium to answer the question that you actually want. So breaking those concepts apart of, are you familiar with my brand? Is it, how do you use it? Why do you like it, or not like it? Is a much more balanced way and a sort of discrete way of asking and getting at the answers there. And the final thing that we want to think about, I would say the most common problem that I run into when we do qualitative research is being aware of selection bias. So selection bias is obtaining a sample that isn't actually representative of the broader population that you intend to look at or be analyzed. And this is particularly problematic because we tend to hear from users that are the easiest to hear from. And that is often, your power users, the people that you've already convinced, and they're providing you with a very slanted view of how to use of the insights that you want to generate. And so we often want to push people to say, who are the people that we're not hearing from? Who are the warm leads? Who are the people that are unhappy with the product? Who are the people that are lukewarm? Often people that are lukewarm are very hard to get to talk to you. People that don't like your product have a lot of opinions. And so we want to go out of our way to create a sample that's a little bit more representative than just the power users. And sometimes that means, getting the power users to answer your questions for free, and then paying people who are a little bit trickier to get to answer questions later on. So avoid selection bias by creating a representative sample when you talk to folks. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shirin to talk a little bit more about our quantitative research process.
Awesome. Yeah, so hopefully now that you have some insights on how to leverage behavioral science in terms of your qual, we want to kind of do the same for your quant. We fully recognize that our goal here is to not walk you through how to do quant research, but more so how to leverage behavioral science in the context of your quant research. So there's a framework that we've actually adopted from our friends at Common Sense Lab. It's called the 3B framework. And this is a framework that we generally use to leverage behavioral science in terms of how we do our quant. There's 3 steps to it. The first step is defining the key behavior, and then removing barriers and amplifying benefits. We're going to dig into each one in just a sec. So with respect to defining your key behavior for your product or your interface, et cetera, one of the common challenges that we see people make is that they actually mistake the outcome that they're trying to create for the behavior. So as an example, I want my users to, lose weight as an outcome, but the key behavior, an uncomfortably specific key behavior would be, I want to have them go for a run every Tuesday, or I want to reduce acquisition cost for our app could be an outcome. And in contrast, a key behavior would be, I want our users to open up a new savings account during their first use. So as you can see, the difference is that when you define a key behavior, you're able to get actually pretty uncomfortably specific, and that really allows you to do the next steps in a much better way. Speaking of next steps, so once you've kind of figured out what is that key behavior that you want the user to do in your product or on that interface, then what you want to do is figure out all the ways that they might have friction in terms of doing that key behavior. And you want to systematically remove any barriers that they have for that. Now, there's a number of different behavioral science principles that we use. Obviously, we don't have a whole day with you today, so we're going to just cover some of the common challenges that we see with product design. The first one is cognitive load. Now, cognitive load is a really fancy term in behavioral science for keeping it simple. And so one of the ways that we see cognitive load being introduced is either in the design, just the visual design, choice of typography, fonts, spacing, colors, etc., and also in terms of jargon. Like, are we using language that is very comfortable to us because we deal with this product day in, day out, but it might not be actually common terminology that your users use, and it might be very daunting to them. So figuring out where you might have cognitive load in terms of your interface and helping reduce that. This is Asana, project management tools, one of the pages of their interface, and we think they did a really good job with reducing the cognitive load. So you can see this in both just the visual design. There's a nice amount of spacing and just beautiful design and typography. They're also very mindful of what they're loading into what we call your working memory. So you're that kind of temporary cache in your brain where they very clearly communicate exactly what the end benefit of using their product is. So that's obviously a really good example. And then they followed through with that low cognitive load in their sign-up process. So again, you can see not a lot of distractions for the user. It's pretty simple. The call to action is very clear as well. Now, another couple of concepts to think about in terms of removing barriers for your users is another challenge that we see is that people assume that giving their users more options and more choices is actually a good thing, because again, they think that the users are more like Spock and they're decision optimizers, and they can make the optimal choice. But in contrast, we recognize that as humans, as Homer Simpsons of the world, when we're presented with one too many options, we actually basically take a step back and many times just don't make a decision. And so figuring out where that you might have too many options that you've presented and how you can systematically reduce choice becomes really important. And similar in vein to that, also thinking about where can you introduce defaults into the process, so that again, the user, that Homer Simpson, doesn't have to make a decision or a choice, because more decisions, more choices, more input fields, etc., these all become barriers for Homer, and at some point he might leave. Okay, so now that we've kind of basically greased the way in terms of that key behavior, we've gotten uncomfortably specific in defining what we want the user to do in that interface or in our product. We've figured out all the ways that they might have barriers towards adopting that key behavior, and we've thought about removing those barriers. Now comes the additive part. And this is kind of where we want to think about how do we introduce all the benefits that the user will get and make that much more salient for them in terms of, wanting to do that key behavior. So this is also an area where probably the over 300 research-backed principles that we tap into from behavioral science becomes really important. Again, we don't have a whole lot of time, so we're going to walk you through some of our go-to principles that we usually go to try to figure out, would this principle be applicable here? So the first principle that you see here is called social proof. Good news is this should be very familiar to us. So as humans, we basically look to others to guide our decisions. And this might be intuitive. You want to choose a doctor, you're probably going to go ask your friends, etc. And there's a different types of social proof at play. So sometimes you might be looking at expert social proof, and sports ads, etc., that you see here, those are particularly effective at leveraging expert social proof. So the idea with expert social proof is that you're leveraging somebody that I want to aspire to be. They're somebody aspirational that I want to just be like. And so this could be somebody aspirational. It could be influencers in that space. It could be a thought leader, etc., that is leveraging your product or solution. Pure social proof, on the other hand, is people just like me. So it's people that are closest to me in terms of circumstance and so forth. And then finally, numbers social proof is basically saying there are a large number of people doing this. So you might be familiar, McDonald's says, billions and billions of people served. So just an example of social proof in real life. This is actually a company that was founded by two Harvard grads. And basically, they founded this company after reading Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. He's a behavioral scientist. And the core principle used in their product and their offering is this idea of pure social proof. So their goal is ultimately getting people to reduce their energy consumption. And the way they do that is they send you these really beautiful reports that basically show your energy consumption as compared to your neighbors. So you can see where you rank as opposed to your efficient neighbors, etc. And so this is a really good idea of, again, leveraging this idea of pure social proof. I think they reported about an 80% response rate to their emails when they leveraged this concept.
They were more effective than paying people to do to reduce their usage. They were more effective at giving them free usage. And they tested it a whole bunch of against a bunch of other different types of ideas, and the most effective one was telling you about your neighbors.
Absolutely. Okay, another concept that we have a bit of a go-to for is called framing. And so in behavioral science, if I were to tell you, hey, I have got frozen yogurt and it is 80% fat-free, versus I would tell you I've got frozen yogurt and it's 20% full of fat, you're more likely to choose 80% fat-free. We all know those two things are exactly the same. And so the idea is that people basically act differently based on how the choices are presented to them. And so this is actually a really interesting one, because a lot of times when you're thinking about the benefits of your product, thinking about how you can reframe it for people so that a different frame might be much more palatable and interesting to people. An example of this is actually a client of ours that we worked with here in Silicon Valley. They are a real estate technology company. They're using technology to displace traditional realtors. So in the US, realtors typically charge, say, 3% to sell your home, with really, it's anywhere between 1 to 1.5%. So radically less. Now, in the Bay Area, because homes are egregiously expensive, that difference in percentage can translate to up to $20,000 on average in terms of a home price. Now, one thing we know from behavioral science is that while Spock is pretty good with understanding $20,000, Homer Simpson has a really hard time trying to grasp and understand $20,000. And so we knew right off the bat that our task here is how can we basically reframe that $20,000 cost savings, and also recognizing that we wanted to kind of shift it to be something more general because people are buying and selling homes at different price points. And so the idea was, okay, how can we reframe this? And we took a couple iterations of this. Initially, we were thinking, okay, if we reframe it to something hedonic, like, hey, you can go on a vacation or buy a car, that would be interesting. But when we ran our experiments, what we started seeing is that when we were reframing it as something hedonic, but like more relevant to what was happening for the user. So instead of going on a vacation, when it was reframing it as, hey, you can actually use this to, say, remodel your kitchen or pay your mortgage off faster. So basically that reframe was very much relevant to what that user was currently undergoing right now, which is basically buying a new home. Then the results really took off, and we were able to radically reduce their acquisition costs by reframing that benefit of the cost savings into something that was much more tangible, hedonic, and definitely relevant for the user. And so as Brad was speaking, one of the benefits of really uncovering a behavioral insight like this is that once you know this, then this insight can very much live on further into the product journey. It could be part of your sales team's conversation, et cetera. So it's definitely an insight that is very easy to transfer around. It's not like saying the red button worked better than the green button. Okay, so with that, we now kind of want to bring this all together and walk you through a full real-life example of how we leveraged our science of design research methodology to help a client essentially build a better product. And Brad's going to walk you through all the steps of what we did. So I'll transfer it back to Brad.
All right, so let's walk you through the full example here from start to finish. This example comes from a client. They're a large trade association in the construction and agricultural industry, the largest in North America. They have a global presence. And what they do is run a very large trade show every 3 years. It may be the largest in the industry every 3 years. And the challenge that they faced was that this trade show was running. There was a huge spike in interest and excitement. And then in between those 3-year periods, that spike would sort of fall off. And they wanted to figure out how they could leverage that excitement and interest with all the information that they had. And to do this, they decided that they were going to build a platform where people could interact and indicate that they were interested in different products, and then connect buyers and sellers. Very relevant in the world of COVID, where there's a big digital transformation happening. And they built this platform, and unfortunately just wasn't yielding the kind of results and engagement that they wanted. So they came to us and said, hey, what's the deal? Why aren't people doing what we want them to do? We did all of this research. We asked people about what they wanted, and we built it, and now they're not coming. We thought it would be Field of Dreams. So we engaged in our standard science of design methodology. And the first step there is to do this behavioral assessment, where we sort of get into people's kitchens and try to understand what's been going on, try to use the product, look at their data, and figure out where we want to go. And when we did that, we realized that the research that had previously been done was subject to a lot of the things that we talked about earlier in this conversation. They were very biased. So they had gone and said, let's think of all the different features that people might actually want in a web page like this or in a platform like this. And let's ask people if they want them. Pretty rational thing to do. Big list of value propositions. Tell us whether you think this is highly valuable or not valuable. Problem with that is if you just list all of these things out, you don't provide any kind of baseline or contrasting or willingness to pay, what you get is people telling you, yeah, all of this is amazing. And that's exactly what happened. The association got back effectively a long list of 20 things that people said, yeah, we're interested in all of this stuff. So they built all of those things. And what they ended up with was a platform that was trying to do everything for everybody, which, as we know, does sort of nothing for nobody. And so we said, okay, these value propositions might be interesting. We just collected them in a very biased way. So let's go back out into the world, do some qualitative research, and try to understand whether people want this stuff or not. So we went out and we talked to different users of the platform and people who were very engaged with it and people who were not at all engaged with it or thinking about using it. And we very quickly realized that we could cut this list of 20 value propositions down to about 5 because some of them already existed, some of them weren't valuable to people. And when we did this debiasing and sort of contrasting approach, we were very effective at whittling away at this list. So we were able to take these 5, bring them back to the association and the board. They said, well, 2 of those are sort of out of the question. We can't do them really well. But 3 of them are still quite interesting. And that was to be able to contrast products very easily, to be able to read and write reviews effectively, and then to be able to talk to experts. And these 3 features translate very nicely into behavioral science frames. So we wanted to see if we could use relativity, which is the idea of being able to contrast just a few number of products is much more effective than too many or no products. We wanted to see if we could use that frame and some of these social proof frames to talk about reviews and experts as well. So we knew that no one was using the platform in the volume that we needed to run tests. So we moved these tests up the funnel into the marketing domain to both see if there was demand for these products, as well as get the sample size that we needed in order to validate whether there was interest in actually building these different features. And so we ran 5 different ads, 3 of them that tested the different value propositions and frames that we wanted to figure out. And then we also ran one that combined all 3, because if you're Spock, 3 value propositions are better than 1. And then we ran a control to see if just generic ads, what our baseline was, and see if a generic ad was performing as good or better than some of these value propositions. The good news is that marketing works. Our control performed better than most of the ads that had been done before. So if you get an agency to do that for you better than you can do internally, yay, that's great. But then we also were able to provide a lot of insight around what was in demand, because we saw that our relativity hypothesis, our ability to compare products in a sort of narrow but very focused way, was by far the winner, about a 147% increase over our control, which was also already about double the baseline. So it was very easy to see which product we should focus on first, but it also gave us this great hierarchy of interest in the product. So relativity was our winner, but reviews were our second place, and talking to experts were our third place. And so that was really nice because it allowed us to say, what should we focus on first when we're developing these features and products? If you're interested, the aggregate of the 3 performed the exact average of all of the other 3 value propositions. So when you mush all of your value propositions together, it creates an averaging effect instead of an additive effect. And so people are not as Spock-like as you think. So we took these insights, we brought them back and said, okay, let's build a product, a prototype based on these insights, and focus on this contrasting piece and the ads first. And we did just that. We actually put this in front of other people, validated this again, and this prototype is being built. COVID has slowed us down a little bit, but will soon be live. So that's a little bit of an example of our science of design methodology in practice, how you can use behavioral science to do better qual and create very cool insights and portable results in the quantitative realm. And with that, I will leave you with this final image.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us today. We really hope that you were able to take some insights and tips that you would use in how you think about your user research for your products, and ultimately help Homer Simpson make better choices. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.